Welcome back to How Would You Beat, where we discuss how you can use jobs to be done innovation methods to beat your competition. Remember to subscribe and like this podcast. In this episode, we will look at how you could beat Netflix. Netflix is obviously a dominant player in the streaming industry, but their market cap is down 70% year to date, with the market being down as well. But they've also had a net loss of 200,000 subscribers in Q1. They forecast losing 2 million subscribers in Q2. Competition and lifting pandemic restrictions has obviously impacted their business. And subscription sharing as well. And interestingly, they lost 700,000 subscribers in Russia after the war in Ukraine. So they were trading at a price to earnings of 92x, which is a huge multiple, obviously baked in because investors thought they were going to continue to grow very fast. Price to earnings ratios are obviously related to how fast a company's growing. They're now down to a 17 times price to earnings ratio. So still performing well. They're 45% of video streaming, the largest audience amongst all the streaming players. And they have good evidence in their past of getting jobs done versus their competition. So how can we use jobs to be done to analyze Netflix? And how would we beat Netflix using jobs to be done? Or how could Netflix turn around and continue to grow its business using jobs to be done? So how would you beat Netflix, Jared?
Yeah, I think, you mentioned competition being stiff. So we could start there. Who is their competition? And the way we try to understand that through a jobs to be done lens is what is the job Netflix is being hired to do and what else is being hired to do that in competition with Netflix? So what else would you choose to use instead of Netflix to get the same job done? And I think, the obvious one is entertainment. Right, I'm trying to be entertained or get entertained, and Reed Hastings is actually well known for thinking this way, and has been quoted as saying Netflix is competing with a bottle of wine. So in that case, he's saying the job to be done is to relax at the end of a day. Hopefully it's the end of the day if wine is your other choice. And so I think we can look at it through that lens. I think it's a very interesting lens. We can look at two key jobs, get entertained, relax at the end of the day. And we can ask, who is the competition then? So Jay, what are some of the players there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what's interesting, I'll get into that in a second, but if you think about it through this lens, what they did was a very, very big digital transformation in their business, because they started out, as people may remember, as a DVD mailing service. So what they really did is attack consumption jobs first. And just a refresher on the theory, in jobs to be done, there's three types of jobs. One are the functional jobs, which is what are you trying to do with the product? Why are you using it? What's the goal you're trying to achieve? Yeah, like get entertained. That's a very functional job. The consumption job relates to using the product. So if you wanted to get entertained in the world of VHS tapes, you had to go to a Blockbuster, and then Blockbuster, decided, okay, you can get DVDs, so you could go to their store and rent DVDs. And, Blockbuster was a very successful company for a long time. And Netflix basically competed in that consumption dimension. They said, well, no one wants to get in a car, drive to a store, rent a DVD, bring it home, then have to bring it back. That's very time consuming. And you could measure speed and accuracy of that. As we always say, innovations help get jobs done faster and more accurately. And in that case, it really was a consumption opportunity to really change the way the functional job was done. And they were very successful. You could hold the DVD for weeks and send it back later, right? Which is Blockbuster was famous for late fees, right? You're like, oh gosh, I didn't get it back in the 2 days or 3 days or whatever, and they charged me extra. So then it cost you like $50 to rent a movie.
Right. So to draw it out a little bit, the framework, it's the functional job here would be get entertained. The solution you choose would be watch a movie. And the way to do that, you could consume the Blockbuster solution, which required driving to a nearby store, walking around the aisles. I remember my friends and I used to do this in high school. We'd walk around the aisles for 45 minutes, arguing about what movie to watch. And then you'd have to bring it home, put it in your DVD player or cassette player. And then Netflix was like, if you want to watch a movie, we can mail it to you. That'll be faster and more accurate. And then ultimately they said, when you want to watch it, just click, and then it'll be there on your screen. And that'll be even more fast and accurate to consume a solution of watch a movie. Now, if you wanted to compete on the functional job of get entertained, well, that would be different solutions, such as go to a concert, go to a play, drink a bottle of wine and hang out with your friends, go to dinner,
go to a restaurant,
those are other solutions to get the core functional job done of get entertained.
That's right. Yeah, and that's great. So and there, even though, especially in the U.S., we consume an enormous amount of media, probably more than what's good for us. There are other entertainment options, and should Netflix get into those markets? Well, of course, you can stream video games. So video games are another way of interacting with a screen, and essentially Netflix has a platform to deliver stuff to your screen. Maybe not as much interaction as you have with a gaming console. But should Netflix buy a gaming console company? That's an interesting question. We saw this very acutely in the pandemic, where we had analyzed Zoom and video streaming services before and said airlines should buy them because they're helping get the same job done. For example, salespeople acquiring customers. You can use Zoom, or you can get on a plane and go to the. And now, of course, Zoom is worth more than the airline. It might be worth more than the airline industry, depending on the day.
I haven't checked recently, but could be.
So that's an interesting question. And then, so there's the entertainment, the whole scope of entertainment, right?
And that kind of leads us back to the original competition question, right? So you've got the other streaming services, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, you've got HBO Max, all kinds of content distribution streaming networks that are playing TV and movies. But then this is something that I don't know that analysts are talking about, but you do have competition from video games, from, eventually the metaverse. I don't know how many people are using those entertainment solutions instead of watching content, as it were. But it could be a serious threat. And to raise that question of should they consider acquiring one of those companies?
Yeah, I think that's definitely worth the analysis. And what I would say is also that people are hiring video as a platform for a huge number of jobs. And obviously in this case, one of Netflix's biggest competitors is YouTube. YouTube, which of course is directly getting into YouTube TV, like, competing head on with streaming services. But the interesting thing about YouTube is that the diversity of content, because it is also user-generated, it's not curated like Netflix, means that you can get an enormous number of jobs done with YouTube that you can't with Netflix. So good example are education for almost anything. I play some music with my daughters. You want to learn a song, there is somebody who has posted a YouTube video to tell you how to play the song. I mean, it's just extraordinary. You want to go advanced into music theory, you want to learn, computer programming, you want to learn how to repair your car. There's just an enormous long tail of effectively you could categorize it as education. And that's true. There's health videos, there's exercise videos, there's professional skills, there's obviously news and politics. Not all of it entirely accurate, obviously, but that does exist. So Netflix should look at, should it, for example, get into user-generated content. Now, YouTube is a dominant platform, obviously. Like this, everybody posts and views user-generated videos on YouTube. But should they compete that way? Well, possibly.
Yeah, and I think what's worth mentioning there is that it's a solution that could help get jobs done. So first they have to figure out what jobs do they want to play in? What are the good market opportunities for them where the competition isn't really killing it? So, for example, is learn a new skill a job they want to get into, or is entertainment big enough for their growth aspirations? And that can then dictate this question of, should we get into UGC or not? What would be the optimal way to help people learn a new skill if we want to get into that? What I think is kind of interesting about Netflix is in the entertainment job, they have done things differently and attempted to differentiate. So one of the things that they do is produce a lot of original non-English speaking content, right? So they make content, in Portuguese, in Brazil, in Spanish, in Spain. You'll be watching things in Korean, Squid Game, for example. And that appeals to me for getting a job done that, for example, Disney Plus is not, which is, entertain myself and connect with other cultures and learn about them. And if you are living in a different country, it's not the U.S. It's see your culture reflected back at you. Connect with your identity, et cetera. And Disney Plus is not doing that. Disney Plus is producing large blockbusters, only English speaking language. So there's a job and segmentation question there about what the biggest opportunities are. Disney Plus is better at the job of entertain my kids, keep my kids focused on something else so I can get a small break in the evening.
Yeah.
And these jobs all matter a lot when you're choosing not only what is the platform you deliver on, but what is the content you produce. What are the choices you make about who should be producing your content, the style they have, the nature of the content, and what it does for people.
Yeah. And that's a great point, because Netflix is also a two-sided market. It's got the consumers of the entertainment and it's got the producers of entertainment. Mm-hmm. And, they famously spend an enormous amount of money buying content to get it on their platform. And for a long time, that seemed to be going extremely well. They raised a bunch of debt to spend on content and they had subscriber growth. But, are we seeing this kind of peak subscribers at Netflix? And now they've got to pay back all that debt, and they've got to, really make it profitable and grow as well. So the question is, could they use jobs to be done to then figure that out? And I think they could also help the content creators. They could build tools that help people figure out what kind of content that they should actually invest in. Because, content creation is, when it's not user-generated content, is really expensive. Right. So if you're, investing a ton of money in a TV show or movie, mitigating that risk that, well, no one's going to really like this thing. Now that's exceptionally hard to do. It's not an obvious problem to solve, obviously. But then the same idea on, and I know they're doing some of this on the kind of recommendation end side, on the viewers, like what should I watch? We mentioned this before, but my wife and I have like 27 minutes before like in any given week to watch entertainment. We spend 15 of those looking for something to watch, and then it's just a disaster. It's the modern digital equivalent of walking around the Blockbuster store not knowing what movie to watch, right?
Exactly.
And that's still not really fast and accurate. So there's obviously a lot of work they could do there. But I do think it's interesting. The reason I brought up their digital shift on the consumption job is they already at a big juncture in their history made the decision to transform themselves into basically a new platform, which was streaming, which is effectively a software platform. And so could you then look at jobs that they wanted to go after, like let's just say education or, skills development. And that's a huge market, obviously. I mean, it's very, very big and people are willing to pay for it. And video, the way you're doing it today, even like just take music. Let's say you wanted to learn a song. It's okay. You kind of watch some guy, but you don't even know if it's the actual way the song's performed, but it's better than what you know. And so you sit down and you try and do it, and who knows? It's probably not very accurate. But also, there's no tools to say like, Jared, you're making progress against learning this song or learning this skill. It's literally just watch the video. There's no feedback at all.
Yeah.
So they could look at those jobs around learning skills and say, okay, this is where people struggle with that, and there's an opportunity where video is one element of the platform, but they would then need to become even more of a software company. Because remember, they were a mailing company. they mailed you stuff, so it was literally a physical distribution company. You can't think of like two more different things than like physically distributing, a product than like building a streaming services. They really are. Even though the end user experience is watching a video, the actual like what it took. And remember, famously, they tried to separate the companies, and there was this.
Yeah, I think one thing you're pointing out is pretty interesting, which is when you're choosing growth opportunities, you can look at what is the job we're in? Is there still room to grow within it? And how would we innovate our current platform to get more of the job done and deliver more customer value against that job? You can also look at what is our platform good for and say, well, what other jobs could we move into that aren't our current job? And then what would it take to differentiate from competitors in those markets? So, video is good for learning. Maybe we should get into learning. Well, what would we have to do with our platform to really differentiate from YouTube? And as you say, like, well, maybe provide assessment. How are you progressing against learning that? And I think it's a really nice strategic framework, right? Is your current job big enough that you can grow within it, and there's ways to differentiate from the competition even further? Or is your platform good for other jobs and you can move into other markets? If you can do both at the same time, that's a nice hedge, right? That's a good way to grow a lot if you have the resources.
Yeah, and they are already, a software company. They're delivering, a web app to your browser. You can log into Netflix from a browser. So to build on that, it's less of a change than going from a DVD distribution company.
Right.
And that's what I think is interesting is that you look and you mentioned assessment steps, and just to remind people, jobs have these series of steps that are, understanding, planning, executing, assessing, revising, concluding. And, in order to get the whole job done, you need to go through all those. So that's a great example of where YouTube, it just doesn't address any of the critical steps because it's just a video playback. So it can't do any of the initial assessments. It can't do any of the kind of what you need to revise in your practice routine to learn the skill, like learn how to play the song correctly. It doesn't have any of that. It could, but that's also a way that Netflix could really differentiate. Is that if you go after, they could help user-generated content, but they'd also could be a platform for creators to create content that then does get the whole job done. And that is, we see that again and again in markets, that like the real innovation comes from platforms that get more and more of the job done.
Right.
And, there's a gazillion historical examples of this, right? Even Kodak, which I love, one of the great companies for 60 years, one of the reasons they succeeded is because they got the whole job done. Their first camera, the Brownie, this people may remember, they've seen it in these old movies where like to take a photograph, you had to be a chemist, right? You stood there with the thing you put over your head and like this, powder-based flash, and then you had to take it back into your chemical laboratory to be able to develop a photograph. And Kodak got more of the job done. Their Brownie campaign was one click and we do the rest. So that you had a camera, you clicked it, you mailed it in, and Kodak chemists would, make a photo they developed for it and send it back. And the Brownie was a dominant product for 60 years. I mean, it was an enormous success. It put Kodak, on the map, made them one of the greatest companies of the time. And then they went bankrupt because they stopped innovating in getting the job done better and getting all of the job done, right? You still needed a Kodak camera, and you had to ship the film somewhere to get it developed, and then digital cameras came along, and like, there's no developing film. My children just think that's just absurd that like pick up your photographs somewhere. They take like 1,000 pictures a day, right?
Yeah.
So that's such an example of where, you're always at risk if you're not expanding what you're doing for your customers. And for Netflix, that's the content creators as well as the viewers.
Yeah, and it's interesting thinking about getting into other jobs. We talked in a couple episodes ago about travel and how virtual travel could be a threat or a partner to Airbnb. And that's a video platform to a certain extent, right? Or a streaming platform, right? You could imagine how Netflix could take some of their international content and position it as a trip, essentially, like getting the same job done as a trip would, which is, exploring a new culture, learning about it, exploring a new place. And that's I think, travel video content helps you do that. So is there something they can build in addition to just showing you the content that helps you feel that way? Can you interact with people who are watching that content who are from those cultures and from those places, and so you can experience it more richly and more deeply? What can you do around the streaming of the video to make a travel experience happen?
Yeah, and of course you mentioned the metaverse. That's and we talked about this before. That is. And I would be surprised if Netflix is not looking at this in detail. That would be, obviously a huge mistake, at least to not assess it. And we talked about this before. What is the metaverse useful for? Like that's got to be there's got to be an underlying job. It gets done better, and certainly for entertainment, it's it's gonna be pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And you can already see that in the early metaverse. But you're right. I mean, it could be that like. We really do just experience movies or whatever the movie version of the metaverse is in 3D. It's pretty amazing to be, in a narrative, not just mentally, but it literally physically looks like you're in the space where the narrative is taking place. That's pretty extraordinary.
Right.
And you're right. That means that then that type of platform also enables you to get a ton of jobs done in that platform. In the same way that the internet as a streaming platform enabled jobs to get done in a very different way. And that's what I think is interesting as well, is this long tail aspect of YouTube, where you really have, just because you set up a different platform, you have the ability to get so many more jobs done. Blockbuster was not going to rent videos that enabled you to figure out an obscure song by an obscure artist, right? There's no money in it, right? Because you have to have that physical store presence, and you have to inventory, and the inventory is costly, and you got to make sure someone can find that it's even in your store, et cetera. Whereas if you type in, obscure Herbie Hancock song you want to learn, you can probably find some video of it on YouTube. So it's enabling these jobs for the platform. And that's true with the metaverse. You'd still want to start with studying the jobs so you know what they are, but you should factor in the fact that there's this new platform that could get the job done better.
Yeah, and it's an interesting way to think about it would be that when the cost of content production is really low, you can get more jobs done. You can spread across a wider variety of jobs, but you're less likely to get all of one job done, right? Get all the steps done. When cost of content production is high, you can really zoom in on one job and nail it from step 1 to step 12, however many steps there are. So that's a strategic choice as well, right? To go shallow across a lot of jobs, hundreds like YouTube does, or to go really deep in, a few, and deliver full value to a more premium market. And that's something that, Netflix is kind of middle of the road there, right? You have to pay monthly, which is a lot more than what you have to pay YouTube, which is nothing.
Right.
So the pricing model impacts how much of the job customers might expect you to get done and how well they expect you to get it done.
Yeah, and it's interesting. the opportunity to get the job done better really should guide all of the decision making. And I think Netflix now is a good example of where companies can capitalize on some big platform changes that happen, and they do happen. So, for example, airlines, the invention of the airplane, like obviously that like created the opportunity for a type of travel at just 10x speed than you could get by trains or cars. And that was true for the internet. It was clear that people were going to really adopt streaming because it was faster and more accurately. That, it didn't take a genius to say like, well, it's going to be a better experience if I can just click this button and it shows up on my TV rather than having to go down to the store, get in my car, et cetera. I remember streaming stuff when it was, 120 pixels wide, and it looked worse than 1970s television. It was terrible. Yeah. You couldn't, you definitely were not going to watch a Hollywood production on it. But like Moore's law, it didn't take much to figure out that bandwidth costs were dropping dramatically, and they were essentially going to become free. And that combined with bandwidth, the cost, also the speed of bandwidth combined with much faster computers, you were going to hit a digital media, tipping point. And even Steve Jobs, remember when he came back to Apple, this is basically what he said. Our strategy is digital media. We're going to make the Mac into a digital media hub. And then, of course, like they added on the iPod. He knew that media was going to go digital. 1,000 songs in your pocket is so much better than walking around. I had those CD changers, where you had like 300 CDs in each of them. Like it was a nightmare. I mean, that was better than having a record collection because I could literally have my 3 CD changers play music all day long. But clearly 1,000 songs in your pocket was better, and clearly 0 songs in your pocket, or an infinite number of songs in your pocket, was even better, right? That's what streaming is.
Yeah, and Google made that bet with YouTube, right? When they bought YouTube, it wasn't high quality. It would buffer a lot. It was hard. It's incredibly slow to upload your videos. There were all kinds of problems with it.
Yep, and that was true of Gmail. Stephen Levy wrote about this, which is remember, Gmail launched and they gave everybody a gigabyte of storage.
Right.
And people were like, that is nuts. It's going to bankrupt the company. And then Google just done the math. They were like, well, the storage is dropping to the cost per, gig is going to be, almost nothing. And the value of having people store all their email and having the data about people, that's the privacy question, which is a separate issue. But clearly it was going to make sense to have web-based email. It's just you're going to log in from multiple devices. You can access all your mail. It's much better. Remember, you used to have to store locally all your email attachments. You'd have to you'd have to delete it because eventually it would take over your hard drive. That seems like insane now, but it's really analogous that to what Netflix is doing. So they've got to be looking forward and saying, okay, are we going to stand still here in this view of streaming, or are we going to help get more jobs done with the shifting technology that we know? I mean, the metaverse is going to come. Now
I think Web3 is another great example, which is like streaming was 15 years ago in the early 2000s, where it's difficult to use. It has some technical problems, but when you conquer that, at the end, there's some payoff, right? And it depends on what part of Web3 you're talking about, what part of crypto you're talking about, but it's easy to look at it and say, too hard to use, doesn't make sense, I don't get it, why bother? But if you start to look at some of the underlying jobs, that if you can overcome some of the difficulty to use today, that could get easier in the future, and how it gets those jobs done and what the payoff is against those jobs, you can see why there's so much money pouring into it. So I think that's the key, is when the consumption aspects are really, really difficult, but some people are overcoming those anyways to do it, then ask why. Like, what is the payoff they're getting at the end? What job are they able to get done on this platform, even though it's hard to use today? And assume it's going to get easier, and that's where there's big opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, Web3, I think, is a whole different discussion, obviously. But the idea I agree with is that you've got, if you're deciding what your product strategy should be and what you should do with your product roadmap and where should you point your roadmap, in which direction, you've got to factor in what's happening with these platforms, because they're changing incredibly fast. I mean, nothing has ever accelerated like this in the history of human evolution over millions of years. Literally, it's just unbelievably unprecedented. And the rate of change is accelerating, which is hard to grasp. So that the rate of change is increasing every year. So that does mean that you've got to look. The good news is the customer's jobs don't change. Like, that is the stable target. Right. If you're trying to just hit another like technology wave because you're like, hey, let's be blockchain. For what reason are you doing blockchain? That's not a good bet. But if you're saying, okay, we're going to start to target these jobs, they're very underserved, and there are some underlying platform changes that are emerging that clearly could relate to getting the job done better, right? So maybe Web3, a good example would be that if you can have more of your identity and all of your data secured around you rather than stored in these silos called Google or Facebook or Amazon, right? So that if you had your identity, then if you went to Netflix, you're like, here's my identity. You tell me what to watch tonight, because I got 30 minutes before my kids scream at me, and I just want to be entertained for 30 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, another thing you could look at is NFTs, right? So what, should Netflix get into NFTs? Well, ask the question, what job might it help with? And, actors and creative people who are making video content want to connect and monetize a fan base. The fan base wants to connect with the artists that are creating it. There's People magazine is a solution for that. It's been around for a very long time. So can you do something with an NFT where the fan feels like they own some aspect of the content and they could connect deeper with the artist behind it, and therefore it helps them get that job done better, and it helps the artist monetize their fan base better. So it's not the fact that it's the NFT, it's the fact that it helps those underlying jobs get done better.
Yeah. And I think this is a great way to look at what could potentially happen at Netflix, because if they just maintain themselves as a streaming service, and at the end of the day, what they're doing is you log in and click around and try and watch a movie or a television show, that's not a good strategy. That will exhaust itself. And, we're kind of seeing it top out right now. They're forecasting losing 2 million subscribers. That's not growth by definition. So it doesn't mean it's all over for Netflix. They've been very good in the past in making this type of strategic shift.
Yes.
But this is where I think if you wanted to compete with them, as we always say, you would not want to create a Netflix, lookalike. And that's kind of unfortunate. I mean, Apple, has created Apple Plus. It's kind of a disappointing thing in my view for Apple to do. I mean, I know they,
Apple TV,
bought Beats, Apple TV. It's like, do we really need Apple making Jennifer Aniston, series? Like, that's what Apple needs to do. All the problems in the world they could solve, that's it. And, they make some good stuff, and they've won some awards because it's like high quality companies. So of course they hired high quality, Hollywood to make high quality stuff. So, okay, fine. But there's so many other jobs they could go after. And it's going to get really competitive. It already is. And I think that's where Netflix would benefit from thinking differently. I mean, certainly Apple, is big enough they can spend whatever they want to buy.
Yeah, and they have a user lock-in that Netflix doesn't have, so when they get into when they make a Me Too product, they have a customer acquisition strategy that helps it get off the ground. Doesn't mean it's going to last forever, but it helps it a lot.
Yeah. And, there's so much that as a streaming platform, you could, if you looked at different jobs, expand the platform from, we've talked about education. We mentioned a little bit like health and exercise. I mean, people definitely need to improve their health. News, politics, voting, creating a more informed citizenry, being a new type of news organizations that does, try and filter. There's a ton of opportunity there. And by the way, CNN Plus is a great example of where if you wanted to go after that market, do not just create a streaming service for news that people have to pay with, right? It failed in like 48 hours or whatever because it's undifferentiated. It's not getting the job done any differently. So you want to look at the jobs and say, well, if we're going to do this for news, which is a big market, like how would it be different? Like what would be different about it? And that was where you'd want to figure out like where people are underserved, where the target segment is, all that. So there's no shortage of market opportunity from jobs that are likely underserved. And I think that is where Netflix could fend off competition and turn around and right the ship and continue to grow.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for listening. That's a good spot to end. Remember to subscribe and like to this podcast. And if you want to learn more about Jobs to be Done innovation methods, visit us at thrv.com. That is thrv.com.